A morning in a billionaire's mansion turns into a nightmare. When his young son suddenly stops responding, doctors are called, panic takes over, and no one has answers. Until a quiet maid walks in, sees what everyone missed, and completely changes the fate of that child. What she reveals leaves the entire house in shock. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. It was supposed to be just another normal morning at the Graves mansion. The sunlight came through the large windows and spread across the living room. Toys were lying all over the soft carpet, showing that a child had been playing there recently. 3-year-old Noah was fast asleep on the couch, hugging his favorite toy. The house was calm. Everything felt like a normal day. Richard, Noah's father and a very wealthy man, came into the room with a smile. He bent down to gently wake his son for breakfast. He expected a sleepy smile or maybe a yawn, but Noah didn't move. Richard kissed his forehead. Still no reaction. He nudged him softly, then a bit harder. Nothing changed. He called his name again, louder now. A strange feeling started to build in his chest. Something was wrong, but he didn't want to believe it. He tried once more to wake Noah, but the boy remained completely still. Richard's heart began to race. Panic took over quickly, replacing all the calm he felt just minutes earlier. He picked Noah up in his arms, hoping the movement would wake him, but the boy's body was limp. Richard shouted for help, his voice filled with fear. He yelled louder, his voice echoing through the halls of the mansion. Servants came running, unsure of what was happening. Richard clutched Noah tightly, almost afraid to let go. His breathing became unsteady as tears began to roll down his face. This couldn't be happening. He had already lost too much. Memories of the day his wife died in childbirth came rushing back. That pain, that helplessness. It was all returning now. His body trembled as he cried. He had never felt this helpless before. His mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. Noah, his only son, wasn't waking up. As the panic spread, the private medical team was quickly called. Within minutes, they were rushing into the living room with their equipment. They laid Noah down and began checking his vital signs. Richard stood beside them, unable to stop crying. He kept asking if his son was okay, but no one gave him a clear answer. The doctor's face was serious, focused. They used machines to scan and check for any signs of consciousness. Richard felt like the world had stopped moving. Every second felt like an hour. He watched, barely breathing, hoping for any sign of movement, but nothing happened. The doctors whispered to each other, which only made Richard more scared. He didn't understand what was going on. He just wanted Noah to open his eyes and smile again. More staff gathered around the room. Everyone was quiet now, watching the scene unfold. The atmosphere was heavy. Even the youngest servants knew something was terribly wrong. Richard was on his knees beside the couch, holding Noah's little hand. He spoke softly to his son, telling him everything would be okay. He begged him to wake up, promised him toys, trips, anything he wanted. But Noah remained motionless. Richard looked completely broken. He was not the powerful billionaire anymore. He was just a father in pain. The medical team continued their work, but their expressions became more grim with each passing moment. No one wanted to say what they were thinking. Richard's crying became louder. He repeated the same questions over and over, but no one answered. Then, something unexpected happened. One of the housemaids stepped into the room. She had been working in the kitchen and didn't know what was going on until she heard the yelling. When she saw Richard crying and the doctors around Noah, she froze for a second. Then she stepped forward. Her name was Clara, a quiet woman who had worked for the family for years. She walked over slowly and knelt beside Richard. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she looked closely at Noah. Her eyes didn't show fear. She gently placed a hand on the boy's chest, then felt his wrist. Richard looked at her, confused and desperate. The doctors noticed her too, and one of them asked her to step back. But Clara didn't move. Something in her face had changed. She whispered something under her breath. What Clara said next caught everyone off guard. She asked the doctors to stop for a moment and let her speak. Richard, still crying, looked at her like she was crazy, but her voice was calm and firm. She said she had seen something like this before, long ago. Something that looked like sleep, but wasn't. She didn't use any big words. She just said Noah needed something different. The doctors hesitated, unsure of what to do. Richard didn't know what to believe, but something about Clara's calm voice made him listen. He moved aside and let her get closer to Noah. Clara took a deep breath and placed both her hands on the boy's forehead. No one knew what she was doing, but she seemed confident. Everyone in the room stayed silent, watching Clara closely. She closed her eyes and remained still for a few seconds. Then she spoke softly again, words that didn't make sense to anyone there. Richard watched in silence, his heart full of fear and hope. Clara opened her eyes and looked at Noah. She whispered his name. Still, nothing happened. Then, for a brief moment, Noah's fingers twitched. It was so small that only Clara and Richard noticed it. Clara smiled faintly and told them it wasn't over. She said they needed to stay calm and wait. Richard didn't know what to think. But for the first time that morning, a tiny bit of hope returned. Something had changed. And now, everyone was looking at Clara, the quiet maid, like she might be the only one who could change everything. Her name was Clara. She had been working at the Graves mansion for only 6 months. She was hired to do simple cleaning tasks, sweeping the floors, organizing rooms, wiping furniture, and sometimes helping in the kitchen when it got busy. Clara never made much noise. She arrived early, worked quietly, and left on time. She didn't talk much with the other staff, and she rarely got involved in any conversation. Most people didn't even notice her when she passed by. To them, she was just the quiet cleaner who kept to herself. She had no fancy background, no visible connections, and no one knew much about where she came from. She lived in a small apartment in the city and took the same bus to work every morning. In the eyes of others, Clara was invisible, just another worker in a big house filled with luxury, noise, and important people who rarely looked her way. What no one at the Graves mansion knew was that Clara had once worked in healthcare. Years before she came to the mansion, she had been a nursing technician at a public hospital in a busy neighborhood. She used to deal with emergencies, help doctors, monitor patients, and take care of people during hard moments. She had learned how to stay calm in chaotic situations. But all of that ended after her younger sister died in that same hospital. It had been a mistake, a medical error that no one fully explained. Clara never recovered from it. She blamed the system, the doctors, and herself for not being able to prevent it. Since that day, she refused to wear a uniform again. She quit her job, cut ties with everyone from that part of her life, and started looking for work outside the medical field. For years, she avoided everything related to hospitals. No clinics, no medicine, nothing. Now, standing in the Graves mansion with a lifeless child on the couch and a father in panic, something inside Clara came back to life. She didn't plan it. It just happened. Her eyes noticed details that others didn't. She stepped closer to Noah when she saw the medical team doing their checks. The machines made noise, the doctors whispered to each other, and Richard kept crying without getting any real answers. But Clara wasn't looking at the machines. She was looking at Noah. She noticed that his chest moved slightly, very slowly, but in a steady rhythm. His breathing wasn't gone. It was weak but consistent. His skin was pale but not cold. There were no bruises, no cuts, no marks that would show trauma. Her instinct told her this wasn't a normal medical emergency. Clara had seen too many real emergencies before. Something about this one felt off, like it didn't follow the usual pattern. She didn't want to interfere. She knew she wasn't a nurse anymore, and this wasn't her responsibility. But something didn't let her stay quiet. She stepped forward, even when others told her to stay back. One of the doctors told her this wasn't her place. Clara ignored him. She wasn't trying to act like a doctor. She just wanted them to stop and look again. She calmly explained what she saw. Weak but steady breathing, no trauma signs, no fever, no unusual heart rate. She told them this didn't look like a seizure or a coma. It looked like something else, something they weren't seeing. Richard was desperate and willing to listen to anyone. He told the doctors to let her speak. Clara leaned down and placed her hands gently on Noah's chest and wrist. She stayed there for a moment, eyes focused, feeling the boy's condition. Her hands weren't shaking. She was calm and serious. She asked a few questions no one expected. She wanted to know what Noah had eaten the night before, whether he had been sick recently, or if he had been playing with anything strange. The staff exchanged looks, but started answering. Clara listened carefully. Nothing made sense. The boy had gone to bed happy and healthy. He hadn't fallen, hadn't hit his head, hadn't been sick. The room where he slept was clean and locked. It didn't add up. Clara asked if the mansion had been sprayed for insects or cleaned with any new chemicals. A maid said yes. They had used a stronger product 2 days ago in the playroom. Clara's expression changed. She asked if Noah had played in that room yesterday. The answer was yes. Clara didn't speak for a second. Then she asked for the label of the product. Someone ran to get it. When it came, Clara read the ingredients and found something alarming. One of the chemicals was known to cause reactions in sensitive children. The doctors were now paying attention. Clara told them what she thought. Noah might have had a toxic reaction, not enough to kill, but enough to shut down his body temporarily, a sort of chemical-induced sleep. It would explain the low heart rate, weak breathing, and lack of other symptoms. The doctors looked at the label again, then at Noah. One of them admitted he hadn't considered that. Clara wasn't proud or angry. She just wanted to help. She asked if they had a specific antidote or a way to flush the chemical from his system. One of the doctors nodded and ran to prepare the treatment. Richard stared at Clara like he was seeing her for the first time. She was just the cleaning lady. But now she was the one who noticed what the others didn't. She didn't want praise. She just wanted the boy to be okay. As the treatment began, everyone in the room became quiet. Clara stood in a corner, watching but not interfering anymore. Her part was done. The doctors were now focused, working fast. Richard kept holding Noah's hand, whispering to him. After a few minutes, the boy's eyelids twitched, then his fingers moved again. A soft, slow breath came from his mouth, stronger this time. Richard gasped and called for Clara, but she didn't move. She stayed where she was, silently observing. The doctors confirmed that Noah was responding to the treatment. The worst part was over. Richard turned to thank Clara, but she had already stepped back into the background. Just like before, she blended in, invisible again. No one there would forget what she did. But Clara didn't want thanks or recognition. For her, it was just something she had to do. She looked at Noah one last time and walked away. A few days before the incident with Noah, the Graves family had hired a new nurse to take care of him. The decision came after recommendations from a private clinic the family trusted for years. She arrived with perfect credentials, polite manners, and a calm voice that put people at ease. Her name was Beatrice. She was in her late 20s, always wore her white uniform neatly, and carried a clipboard wherever she went. Richard approved the hiring without much questioning. He was trying to make sure Noah had the best care, especially after losing his wife. The house staff accepted Beatrice quickly. She was respectful, soft-spoken, and never caused any trouble. At first, she seemed like a good choice. Noah seemed to like her too. She read him books, played simple games, and followed strict schedules for food and medicine. No one had any reason to doubt her at the beginning. At least, not until that morning. Clara, however, had a different feeling. When she first saw Beatrice, something about her felt familiar. It bothered Clara, but she couldn't place the memory right away. She spent the next few days thinking about it, trying to figure out where she had seen that face before. Then she remembered. Years ago, when Clara still worked as a nursing technician, there had been a case at a neighborhood hospital involving serious accusations. A young nurse was being investigated after several patients had strange reactions to common medications. Some had seizures, others passed out with no explanation. There were whispers about someone changing the doses, mixing the wrong drugs, or using expired products. Clara hadn't worked in that department, but she had heard the name, Beatrice. And now, that same person was walking through the Graves mansion, trusted with the care of a child. The memory made Clara uneasy, but she kept quiet. She didn't have proof. Not yet. That morning, when Noah wouldn't wake up, Clara's focus turned sharply to Beatrice. While the doctors and servants tried everything they could to wake the child, Beatrice stood nearby. Her hands were slightly shaking as she held a cloth and stood by the medical team, but her face didn't show shock. She didn't cry or panic. Her eyes just followed the scene without emotion. It was strange. Even the least experienced maid looked more nervous than she did. Clara watched her carefully. Beatrice didn't ask questions, didn't try to help. She just stayed quiet, almost too calm. Clara felt something was wrong. The behavior didn't match the situation. A nurse who cared about her patient would be trying to help, or at least be visibly worried. Beatrice wasn't doing either. Clara's concern turned into suspicion. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but she had seen enough in her past to know when something didn't add up. As time passed and Noah remained unresponsive, Richard grew more desperate. The doctors were focused on machines and lab results. They were talking about sedatives, possible infections, and rare conditions. No one suspected foul play. Clara realized that if someone had done something on purpose, it would go unnoticed. She stepped away from the crowd and went to Noah's room. She started checking things slowly, his toys, his water bottle, his medications. Everything looked normal, but something bothered her. She found the box of pills Beatrice had been giving Noah. It was supposed to be a simple vitamin supplement. Clara opened the box and looked at the pills. The label was correct, but the pills didn't match what she remembered from when she worked in hospitals. These were smaller, coated in a different color. She took one and placed it in her apron pocket. She needed to test it, or at least compare it. Something wasn't right. Back in the living room, Clara watched Beatrice again. She remembered moments from her hospital days, how small mistakes could turn into tragedies, and how professionals who acted too perfect were often hiding something. Clara knew that speaking up would change everything. She had spent years pretending to be just a cleaner. She had hidden her past to avoid the pain of losing her sister, the trauma of medical errors, and the responsibility that came with it. But now, a child's life was at risk. She couldn't stay quiet anymore. She walked up to Richard and the head doctor. Her voice was steady and her eyes were serious. She told them she used to be a nurse and that she needed to speak in private. At first, they hesitated, but Richard, seeing how calm and focused she was, asked everyone to step back. Clara showed him the pill, explained what she noticed, and shared what she remembered about Beatrice's past. Richard was shocked, but also confused. He wanted to believe the best in the people around him. Still, he listened. He called the doctor to examine the pill. Within minutes, the team confirmed that the substance inside was not what the label claimed. It had mild sedative properties, not strong enough to kill, but strong enough to slow body functions in a small child. Clara's suspicion had been right. Richard turned to Beatrice, who stood still, expressionless. She didn't deny anything. She simply said she was following instructions from the clinic. That didn't make things better. Security was called, and Beatrice was removed from the house. The doctor gave Noah another treatment, and soon his condition began to improve. Clara stood at a distance, quietly watching again. But this time, people saw her. They saw more than just a maid. They saw someone who saved a life by speaking up when no one else did. Everyone in the mansion was getting ready to take Noah to the hospital. The doctors were organizing transport, the staff was packing essential items, and Richard was pacing nervously, not knowing what else to do. The tension in the house was growing by the minute. People were shouting instructions, phones were ringing, and the private ambulance was on its way. Clara stood near the hallway, watching the chaos unfold, her mind racing. She knew there wasn't much time. If they took Noah to a hospital, the truth might be lost or covered up. She needed to act before that happened. She took a deep breath, walked directly to Richard, and asked to speak with him in private. He looked confused, but something in her eyes made him nod. They walked into his office, and Clara quietly closed the door behind them. It was time to tell him everything. No more hiding, no more waiting. Clara stood still for a moment, trying to find the right words. Then she told him the truth. She explained how she used to work as a nursing technician. She had experience in emergency care, patient monitoring, and medication handling. She told him about the time she saw patients suffer because of careless decisions. One of those mistakes led to her sister's death. That moment broke her. She couldn't stay in that profession anymore, so she left everything behind and started working simple jobs. Cleaning houses was a way to stay away from the world of medicine. When she applied to the Graves mansion, she never planned to get involved with medical matters again. But now, watching Noah in this state, all those memories came back. She couldn't ignore what she saw. The signs were clear to her. Slow breathing, deep unresponsiveness, but a stable body. These were symptoms she had seen before, and they were not natural. She told Richard her suspicion. Noah was not sick. He had been drugged. Clara explained how the symptoms matched exposure to microdoses of sedatives. These substances were strong enough to weaken the body, but not kill. They caused confusion, sleepiness, and shallow breathing. Most doctors, if not looking for it, would miss it and assume the child was just unwell. Clara had seen these reactions during her years at the hospital. She had even heard of people using these drugs on purpose, to keep patients calm, quiet, or in some cases, to manipulate a situation. Richard sat down heavily on his chair. His face was pale and his hands were shaking. He kept asking why this would happen. Why would someone hurt a child who had no enemies, no conflicts? Clara waited until he was quiet, then looked at him straight and answered with a calm, serious voice. "Because you are a billionaire," she said, "and that child is the key to your inheritance." At first, he looked confused, as if the words didn't make sense. But then, as he thought more about it, the pieces started to come together. He remembered the legal documents, the family arguments, and the way some relatives had shown more interest in Noah than in the boy's well-being. He remembered the inheritance contract that listed Noah as the primary heir if anything ever happened to Richard. That money was worth billions. Clara could see in Richard's eyes that he understood what this meant. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a medical emergency. This was an intentional act. Someone had planned it, quietly and carefully. Richard asked her again if she was sure. Clara nodded. She wasn't guessing. She had seen enough to know when something like this was happening. Her voice remained steady. "This is not a sickness. This is a controlled attack." He couldn't believe what he was hearing, but deep down he knew it was true. It explained too much. It explained the strange calmness of the nurse, the slow symptoms, the timing of everything. He looked up at Clara with tears in his eyes, and asked who would do something like this. Clara said she didn't know yet, but it had to be someone with access, someone who knew the routines, the medication schedules, and the child's condition, someone close enough to switch pills or mix something without being noticed. She told him that if they moved Noah now, the hospital might not find the real cause. The drugs might already be disappearing from his system. They needed to act quickly and quietly. Clara said she would stay and help, but they needed to be smart. This was no longer just about saving the child. It was about finding the person responsible. Richard stood up and looked out the window for a long moment. His mind was full of questions, anger, and fear. But he also felt something else: determination. He turned back to Clara and asked what they needed to do first. She said they had to stop the ambulance, test the medication, and keep Noah under observation with the right equipment at the mansion. They also had to keep this quiet. If the person responsible found out they were suspicious, they might try again or disappear. Richard nodded. He trusted Clara now more than anyone else. He called the head of security and gave new instructions. Then he told the doctor to stay, but not to share any reports with the clinic. Clara stood by, ready to take the lead. For the first time in years, she was no longer hiding from her past. She was using it to protect a life. Richard now understood this wasn't a random crisis, it was an attack, and someone had planned it carefully. As they left the office together, the rest of the house remained busy. No one outside that room knew the full truth yet. Clara and Richard walked back into the hallway, now with a new plan in mind. They would protect Noah, but they would also find out who had done this. Clara felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders, but she didn't back down. This wasn't about her past anymore. It was about doing what was right now. Richard, still shaken but focused, placed a hand on her shoulder and thanked her. "You saved him," he said. Clara didn't respond. She just looked toward the living room where Noah was being monitored. She knew they had stopped something terrible, but the danger wasn't over. Now, they had to find out who was behind it and why. Richard finally saw the truth. His son hadn't just collapsed, he had been attacked. And it was just the beginning. With Richard's hesitant support, Clara took charge of the situation. She began by carefully reviewing everything Noah had eaten or taken over the past few days. She asked the kitchen staff detailed questions, checked the pantry and fridge, and even looked through the trash for empty containers. Clara went through the nurses' daily notes and matched them with the food and supplement schedule. Patterns started to form. Each time Noah was given juice, soup, or vitamins, it had been directly handled by the new nurse, Beatrice. No one else had touched those items. The kitchen had prepared the meals, but Beatrice had insisted on taking care of the final preparations before serving them to the child. Clara found this very suspicious. Richard, still overwhelmed by everything that had happened, tried to stay calm. He followed Clara, trusting her judgment more with each step. She told him they had no time to waste. Waiting for hospital tests could give their enemy a chance to erase all signs. Clara then told Richard something that made him even more nervous. If they took Noah to the hospital now, it might be too late. Not just because of the delay, but because the nurse could have allies there. Maybe someone from the same clinic. Maybe someone who would hide the evidence or block access to results. Clara had seen things like that in her past life in medicine. Sometimes connections inside the system helped criminals disappear. She said they needed to act immediately, right there in the house. She explained that in the hospital where she used to work, they often had to use emergency detox techniques for patients who had been mildly sedated, whether by accident or for surgery recovery. Clara knew how to create a simple liver detox solution, one that could be given safely to children in very low doses. It wouldn't hurt Noah, but it could help push the sedative out of his system faster. Richard looked unsure but nodded. He asked the head doctor on site if it was safe. The doctor, while surprised by Clara's confidence, agreed that the method she described could help in certain cases. Clara moved quickly. She gathered the ingredients she needed from the medical supplies available in the house. It wasn't a complete hospital-grade setup, but it was enough. She prepared a liquid solution and measured everything with precision. She refused to let anyone else do it. Once it was ready, she explained the process step by step, asked the doctor to supervise, and had Richard present in the room the whole time. Clara slowly administered the detox dose to Noah through a small syringe while he was still unconscious. Then they waited. The entire room was silent. No one dared to move. The seconds felt long. Everyone's eyes were on the little boy lying motionless on the bed, his chest rising and falling slowly. After nearly 20 minutes of tense silence, something happened. Noah's fingers twitched. Clara noticed it first, then pointed it out. A few moments later, the boy's lips moved slightly, and then he coughed. It wasn't loud, but it was real. Richard stood up quickly and grabbed his son's hand. Noah coughed again, and his eyelids began to move. His breathing became deeper, more natural, and then, finally, he opened his eyes. He didn't speak right away, but his face turned to the side, and a soft cry came out. Clara stood frozen, hands still raised, as if she couldn't believe it herself. Richard fell to his knees, overwhelmed with emotion. Tears streamed down his face as he hugged his son gently, afraid to squeeze too tightly. The doctor nodded in silent approval, clearly surprised by Clara's success. The staff in the room stood still, many with tears in their eyes. Noah was alive. Clara had brought him back, but the relief didn't last long. Clara stood up and looked at Richard with a serious expression. "This isn't over," she said. "Someone tried to kill your son, and that person is still inside this house." Her voice was calm but firm. The tension returned instantly. Richard wiped his tears and asked what they should do next. Clara explained that they needed to secure all access points. No one should enter or leave the mansion. Every staff member had to stay where they were until the situation was fully investigated. The nurse had to be questioned immediately. The food had to be tested and all of Noah's belongings examined again. Clara told him they needed to treat the house as a crime scene. Richard agreed. He stood up and ordered security to lock down the property. Clara stepped outside the room and spoke to the head of security. She gave instructions clearly, like someone who had done this before. The entire house shifted from panic to controlled alert. The security team responded quickly. Guards were positioned at every door. All kitchen items were placed under supervision. Clara worked with the doctor to write down the treatment that had saved Noah and what they suspected was used to poison him. She insisted on keeping the remaining juice bottles and supplements as evidence. Richard made calls to trusted investigators and ordered a private forensic team to come as soon as possible. Noah was moved to a safe, controlled room with limited access. Only Clara, Richard, the doctor, and 2 guards were allowed in. The other staff were confused and scared. Whispers filled the mansion. No one knew what was really happening. Beatrice, the nurse, had not been seen since the first signs of Noah's collapse. Clara ordered her room to be searched immediately. Richard authorized everything. The atmosphere in the house was no longer just sad. It was tense and suspicious. Everyone became a potential suspect. As night fell, the house remained in lockdown. For now, Noah was stable, and Clara stayed close, checking on him every hour. Richard couldn't sleep. He kept walking around, talking to security, reviewing camera footage, and going over the schedules from the past week. Clara had saved his son's life, but she had also opened a door to something much bigger. This wasn't just a medical emergency. It was a planned attack. Richard didn't know who was behind it yet, but he would find out, and this time he wouldn't rely on outsiders. He would trust Clara. She had proven she was more than a cleaner. She had become the one person standing between his family and real danger. Noah's small breaths filled the quiet room. He was alive, but now everyone in that house was under watch. The attack had failed, but the enemy was still there, hiding in plain sight. Richard gave a direct order to the mansion's security team. The nurse, Beatrice, was to be kept under close watch, but without raising any suspicion. He didn't want her to know that they were on to her. She continued her usual activities, walking around the house calmly, checking her phone and pretending to be just another medical professional doing her job. But her movements were now being tracked. 2 guards stayed near her at all times, under the excuse of house protocol. Richard stayed close to Noah's room, while Clara moved quickly and quietly through the service hallways. She knew where she needed to go. She headed straight to the medical waste bin, located in the back area of the house, where all used gloves, wrappers, and disposable items were thrown out. She opened the lid and dug through the pile carefully, ignoring the smell. After a few minutes, she found what she was looking for, a used syringe hidden inside a crumpled bag. Clara held the syringe in her gloved hands. There was still a tiny amount of transparent liquid inside the barrel. Most people wouldn't have noticed it, but she did. Her training had taught her that even the smallest traces could hold answers. She placed it gently into a sealed container she had brought with her, then went to her room. Using her old contacts from her nursing days, she made a call. One of her former colleagues worked in a lab that could run private, fast chemical tests. Clara didn't give many details, just asked for an urgent analysis. She arranged for a trusted courier to pick up the syringe immediately and waited. While the house remained under lockdown and the nurse continued pretending nothing was wrong, Clara knew the clock was ticking. If the analysis confirmed what she suspected, this would no longer be just an internal matter. It would become a full criminal case. And they needed more proof before making a move. While waiting for the results, Clara took the next step. She went to Beatrice's room with permission from Richard. The door was unlocked. The room was clean, maybe too clean. Nothing looked out of place at first. Clara searched drawers, the closet under the mattress. Then she opened the nurse's handbag, which had been left on the dresser. Inside, she found cash, a few ID cards, and a notebook. The notebook wasn't like a normal planner. It had notes written in strange codes, symbols and short phrases that didn't make sense right away, but mixed in with the codes, Clara found references to bank names and numbers. Some of the entries were linked to large sums of money, and a few dates matched important events from the Graves family's business calendar. There were reminders marked with circles, names of company directors, and even mentions of Richard's late wife. Clara's eyes widened. This was more than a personal attack. It was connected to the family's fortune. She continued digging through the notebook. In the back, she found a small pocket holding folded papers. One of them was a printed email with travel information. Another had a handwritten list of items, some crossed out. Clara noticed one item listed as child sedation, progressing, with a checkmark beside it. Another line read, legal transition, soon. It was becoming clear this was a carefully planned operation, not an isolated act. Someone had sent Beatrice to get close to the family, harm Noah over time, and possibly trigger a legal change that would affect ownership or control over Richard's empire. Clara took pictures of everything with her phone and then carefully returned the items to their places. She didn't want Beatrice to suspect anything yet. Clara then walked straight to Richard's office and showed him the photos. He was shocked, but not surprised anymore. He was starting to realize how close he had come to losing everything: his child, his company, his future. Later that night, Clara received the lab results. The liquid found in the syringe was confirmed as a type of industrial sedative, stronger than anything used in standard medical care. It wasn't illegal, but it was dangerous, especially in repeated doses. The report showed that the substance could cause slow organ shutdown if administered in small, frequent amounts. Clara now had everything she needed: physical evidence, a witness account, and a motive tied to financial gain. She printed the report and handed it to Richard. He read it in silence, hands trembling. The paper nearly slipped from his grip. "This isn't just betrayal," he said quietly. "This is murder in slow motion." He stood up and called for security. Clara stood beside him, ready. The house was no longer in panic. Now it was in control. They had the proof. Beatrice wasn't a nurse. She was an infiltrator, a trained manipulator with one goal: take out the heir slowly and silently. Richard and Clara knew they couldn't involve the police yet. They needed to trap Beatrice with solid proof and catch her in the act of trying to interfere again. Clara asked for one more day to prepare. They would monitor every move, record every conversation, and isolate every object she touched. The next step was to confront her in a controlled environment, with lawyers, cameras, and witnesses. They couldn't afford a single mistake. Clara felt no fear. Her hands were steady, her mind clear. She had spent years hiding from the world of medicine, but now she was standing in the middle of a medical and criminal mystery, and she was the only one solving it. Richard looked at her with deep respect. "You've done more for my family in 2 days than anyone ever has," he told her. Clara didn't reply. She was focused. The evidence was ready, and she would be the one to bring the truth into the light. With all the evidence collected, Clara knew the time had come to confront the woman who had nearly killed Noah. She didn't want to do it in secret or behind closed doors. This needed to be done in front of everyone, the entire household staff and Richard himself. That way, no one could deny what had happened, and there would be no confusion about the truth. Clara chose the main living room, the one where Noah used to play. She asked for everyone to be gathered there, including the guards, maids, the family doctor, and of course, Beatrice. When the staff were all present, Richard entered the room quietly, holding the folder with the lab results. Clara followed him, holding a bag with the items she had recovered: the syringe, the notebook, and copies of the coded notes. Tension filled the room. Everyone looked around, unsure of what was going on. Clara walked to the center and stood in front of Beatrice. Without giving her time to speak, Clara pointed the hot iron she had just unplugged from the laundry room directly at the nurse and said in a loud, clear voice, "Who are you really?" The room fell silent. The iron was still warm, steam rising from it. Beatrice froze. The rest of the staff stood still, their mouths slightly open in shock. No one moved, no one spoke. The tension broke when Beatrice took a step back, her eyes darting toward the door. She tried to leave the room, but 2 security guards blocked her path immediately. Richard remained quiet for a moment, letting Clara take the lead. Clara's voice was firm. She told everyone that Beatrice had lied about who she was and had slowly been poisoning Noah. The proof, Clara said, was undeniable. Then Richard stepped forward and opened the folder. He read out loud the lab results showing the sedative found in the syringe. His voice was steady, but his face was full of anger. As Richard spoke, Clara opened the bag and pulled out the used syringe. She held it in front of the group, showing the tiny trace of liquid still inside. Then she pulled out copies of the notebook pages, the ones with strange codes and references to financial events linked to the Graves family. She explained how everything fit together: the slow poisoning, the access to the child's food, the coded planning, and the connection to potential financial gain if something happened to Noah. Beatrice began to panic, her calm face twisted with fear. She raised her voice and started yelling that it was all a lie. She said Clara was framing her and that none of this was true, but no one believed her anymore. The evidence was too much. Clara didn't argue. She just looked at her quietly, waiting. Beatrice screamed that she was a nurse and had done nothing wrong, but her voice shook. Her lies had finally lost their power. One of the housemaids stepped back, clearly frightened. Another staff member started crying softly. The scene was hard to watch. A woman who had acted so normal, so trustworthy, was now screaming and shaking in the middle of the room. Clara handed the papers to the doctor, who looked through them carefully and nodded. Everything Clara had said was true. Richard picked up the phone and called the police without hesitation. He told them to come immediately and report to the mansion security on arrival. Beatrice continued shouting that she was innocent, but the guards didn't let her leave. They kept her seated and under watch. No one moved to comfort her. No one stood by her side. The staff, still in shock, began to understand the danger they had all lived with. Richard thanked Clara quietly, his voice full of emotion. She had saved not just his son, but his entire household from something none of them had seen coming. A short time later, the sound of footsteps filled the hallway. The police arrived in plain clothes, escorted in by security. They entered the living room and calmly listened as Richard and Clara explained what had happened. Clara handed over the syringe, the documents, and the photographs. The officers asked Beatrice a few questions, but she had no answers. Her words were scattered, her hands trembling. They placed her in handcuffs and read her rights. She didn't fight back this time. Her eyes were empty. As she was taken away, the rest of the staff stood silently. No one said a word. Clara stood still, her hands clasped in front of her. Richard stood beside her, his face pale but steady. The danger was now out of the house, but the damage would take time to heal. What had happened wasn't just a crime. It was a betrayal of trust, and it had nearly cost them the life of a child. Moments later, the sound of small feet broke the silence. Noah, now fully awake and feeling better, walked into the room. His steps were wobbly, but he smiled when he saw his father. Richard dropped to his knees and opened his arms. Noah ran straight to him, wrapping his arms around his neck. Richard hugged him tightly, unable to hold back the tears. The entire room watched, many crying silently. It was a moment of relief, of gratitude, of realization. Clara stayed where she was, watching them with quiet satisfaction. No applause, no celebration, just the clear truth that the boy had survived because someone had dared to act. Not because of money, not because of power, but because of one woman who had been invisible in that house, a woman with a past she had once hidden. Clara had saved Noah, and everyone there knew it. The forgotten maid had become the reason that little boy was alive. In the days that followed the dramatic confrontation, Clara gave her full statement to the police and investigators. She explained everything she had seen, suspected, and discovered. The used syringe, the coded notebook, the nurse's unusual behavior, the financial documents, all of it was shared in detail. The investigation expanded quickly. The authorities didn't take long to confirm Clara's fears. Beatrice wasn't working alone. She was part of a larger international group that targeted children who were heirs to large fortunes. The group operated quietly, using professionals like private nurses, tutors, and caregivers to get close to the children. They administered controlled doses of sedatives or toxins over time, making the child weaker and sicker each day. The goal was simple and terrifying: cause a death that looked natural and then take advantage of the confusion and emotional chaos to access inheritance funds, life insurance payouts, or other financial assets. It was a cold, professional system, and Noah had almost become one of its victims. The group had already been connected to other suspicious deaths across different countries. Some children had died from unknown illnesses, and their families had never received clear answers. Now, with the evidence collected at the Graves mansion, the authorities had what they needed to connect the dots. Beatrice was just one part of something much bigger. For Richard, the truth was devastating. He had built his empire with discipline and trust in professionals. Now that trust had nearly cost him the life of his only child. He found it hard to sleep. His days were filled with meetings with lawyers, investigators, and child protection agents. But what haunted him most wasn't just what almost happened. It was the fact that he had overlooked the one person who had saved everything. Clara had been right in front of him the whole time, and he had seen her as just part of the background. He hadn't even bothered to learn her full story before this all began. One afternoon, Richard found Clara in the garden, watering the plants near the fountain where Noah used to play. She was quiet, her face calm but tired. He walked toward her slowly and asked if he could speak with her. Clara nodded. Richard didn't start with small talk. He went straight to the point. He apologized, not just for what had happened, but for the way he had treated her before any of this started. He said he was ashamed that it had taken something so serious for him to see her clearly. "I saw you as part of the staff," he admitted, "not as someone who could think, observe, or protect." Clara listened silently, her hands still resting on the edge of the watering can. After a moment, she looked at him and said, "I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because a child needed help. I couldn't save my sister, but I could save him." It was the first time she had said those words directly to Richard. She told him how her sister had died years ago in a public hospital due to a medical error. No one had been punished. No one had cared. That pain had stayed with Clara for years. It had made her run from hospitals, uniforms, and anything that reminded her of that loss until now, until Noah. "When I saw him not waking up," she said, "I felt like I was back in that hospital. But this time, I had a chance to change something." Richard didn't interrupt her. He listened to every word. For the first time, he understood the weight she carried and why she acted so fast and so fiercely when Noah was in danger. Clara hadn't just saved his son. She had faced the one fear that had controlled her life for years. She had fought back, and she had won. Clara said she didn't want money or rewards. She only wanted peace. Richard promised her she would have it. He told her she would never have to worry about work or housing again, and that if she ever wanted to return to nursing or anything else, he would support her in every way possible. Clara nodded quietly, but inside she felt something shift. For years, she had avoided anything connected to her past. But now, that chapter felt like it had finally closed. She had done what she couldn't do back then. She had protected a life. And for the first time, she didn't feel powerless. Her pain had found meaning. Noah had survived. The truth had come out, and the people responsible would face justice. Clara didn't feel like a forgotten maid anymore. She had become someone who mattered, not because of her title, but because of her actions. And that was something no one could ever take from her again. In the days that followed, the mansion slowly returned to normal. The investigation continued, and the story made headlines across the country. But inside the house, things were different. Richard started spending more time with Noah. He also made changes to his company's policies, including new background check procedures and increased security for staff and their families. More importantly, he started treating everyone around him with more respect. He realized that real safety didn't come from money, walls, or cameras. It came from people who truly cared. People like Clara. She was no longer invisible in the mansion. The other staff members looked at her differently now. Some thanked her quietly, others simply treated her with new respect. Clara remained humble, but she accepted their kindness. She didn't need attention or praise. All she needed was the feeling that she had done the right thing. For the first time in a long time, she could breathe without guilt. Richard often watched his son playing again, laughing and full of energy. Every time he looked at Noah, he remembered how close he had come to losing him. And every time he passed Clara in the hallway or saw her walking in the garden, he felt grateful. He had once believed that his wealth could solve anything. But in the end, it wasn't the money that had saved his son. It was Clara, a woman with a hidden past, a quiet presence, and a heart that refused to let history repeat itself. Richard knew now that the most important people in life are not always the loudest, the richest, or the most visible. Sometimes they're the ones in the background, watching, listening, and ready to act when it truly matters. And for Clara, her story had finally come full circle. The past had returned, yes, but this time she had written the ending, and it was one she could finally live with. The nurse was officially arrested and taken into custody. The case quickly drew national attention. As the investigation moved forward, more information came to light. It turned out that Beatrice had used different identities in various countries. She had been involved in other suspicious deaths, all with the same pattern: children from wealthy families who died under unclear circumstances. Once the authorities confirmed her connection to a larger criminal organization, other states and even international agencies got involved. The group targeted rich heirs, mostly children, using subtle poisoning tactics to avoid suspicion. With the evidence from the Graves mansion, the entire operation began to collapse. Clara's testimony was essential. She provided detailed information about what she saw, what she did, and how she uncovered the truth. She was asked to speak in several hearings, and investigators credited her with breaking the case. Her quick thinking and knowledge had exposed something that had been hidden in plain sight for years. As Clara continued to testify and help with related cases, her name started to appear in the media. Newspapers and television channels shared her story, how a housekeeper had discovered a professional criminal operation and saved a billionaire's son. People across the country praised her. Medical professionals, hospital associations, and even former colleagues reached out to thank her for her bravery. She received official honors from a few organizations, including one for medical ethics and another for child protection. Hospitals offered her jobs. Some wanted her to return as a technician. Others wanted her to speak to their staff about recognizing medical abuse and reporting it. But Clara turned down all the offers. She told everyone the same thing. She wasn't looking for a career comeback. She had found peace in her current life. Her focus now was Noah. She didn't want to work in hospitals again. What she wanted was to protect the boy she had almost lost and make sure he never had to face danger again. Richard understood and respected her decision. He wanted to make sure Clara was never in a position where she felt small or invisible again. He promoted her to be the house manager. It was a role of leadership and responsibility. She wasn't just in charge of cleaning anymore. She now managed the entire staff, organized the household, and oversaw safety and daily operations. Richard also made sure she had full legal protection and financial stability. He put her name on a trust fund to ensure that no matter what happened in the future, Clara would be safe and respected. More importantly, he asked her to stay with the family, not as an employee, but as someone they loved and trusted. He told her she had become part of something greater than a job. She had become family. Clara was deeply moved. She had come to the mansion just to work, to disappear into silence. But now, everything had changed. The other staff members also began to change the way they looked at Clara. At first, she had been just the quiet woman who cleaned the floors and avoided conversations. Now, they saw her differently. They respected her not just because of what she had done, but because of the way she had done it, with calm, with courage, and without seeking anything in return. Some of the younger maids started coming to her for advice. The older ones began calling her by her first name, with admiration in their voices. Clara didn't let the attention get to her. She continued her work with the same discipline, but everyone could see the difference. She carried herself with quiet pride. She no longer looked like someone hiding from her past. Now, she looked like someone who had faced her pain and used it to do good. The same rubber gloves she once wore while scrubbing floors now felt like a symbol of strength and honor. Justice had been served, the people who planned to harm Noah and steal from the Graves family had been exposed and stopped. The house was safer now, not just because of security systems or bodyguards, but because everyone was more aware. Clara had changed the way people thought. She had proven that danger doesn't always look like danger, and that heroes don't always wear badges or suits. Sometimes heroes wear aprons and keep their heads down until the moment comes to stand up. The danger had been pushed away, and life inside the mansion slowly returned to a normal rhythm. Noah was healthy again. He smiled more, laughed often, and always wanted to be near Clara. Richard found comfort in seeing them together. It reminded him that money could build walls, but only real people could keep a home safe. Clara's presence was now a constant symbol of that truth. But Clara's story didn't end there. Even though the case was closed and the threats removed, her role in the world had quietly expanded. She kept in touch with some of the families from other cases. Some called her for advice. Others just wanted to thank her. She never looked for recognition. She wasn't interested in fame or reward, but she understood now that what happened to her sister had not been in vain. That old wound, which she had carried in silence for so long, had finally helped her protect another life. It had given her a reason to act, to speak up, and to trust herself again. Clara had found her voice. She had faced her past and rewritten her future, not as a victim, not as a forgotten worker, but as a protector. And while the chapter of danger had ended, something new was beginning. She didn't know where it would lead, but this time she wasn't afraid. On the day of Noah's next birthday, the atmosphere at the Graves mansion was calm and warm. It wasn't a massive celebration with decorations covering every inch of the property or crowds of people trying to impress each other. Richard had chosen to keep things simple and meaningful. Only a few close family members, trusted friends, and the staff who had stayed by his side through the recent chaos were invited. Everything had been carefully planned to make the day about Noah and the people who truly cared about him. There were balloons, small tables with snacks, and a big cake with his name on it. Noah, now stronger and happier, ran around the garden laughing and playing, his energy back to normal. He was excited about the games and the presents, but more than anything, he wanted to be close to one person who had become the most important part of his world, Clara. Clara didn't wear her usual work clothes that day. There was no apron, no gloves, no cleaning cart. She wore a simple, elegant dress, her hair neatly tied back. When she walked into the garden, some of the guests looked at her and smiled. They no longer saw her as the quiet housemaid. They saw her as someone who belonged, someone who had earned a place in that family. Noah spotted her as soon as she arrived and ran toward her with open arms. "Aunt Clara!" he shouted with excitement. She bent down and hugged him tightly. From that moment on, Noah didn't leave her side. He held her hand while showing his toys to the guests, pulled her toward the cake when it was time to sing, and insisted she sit next to him during the opening of presents. Clara couldn't hide the emotion in her eyes. Every time Noah looked at her with love, she felt something in her heart that she hadn't felt in years: peace. The other staff, now her teammates, and not just co-workers, treated her with respect and care. They asked if she needed anything, made sure she was comfortable, and included her in every part of the event. The family members who didn't know the full story were told by Richard what she had done. Some were shocked, others were deeply moved. More than once during the party, someone came up to Clara just to shake her hand and say thank you. She smiled politely each time, not looking for attention, but accepting their words with kindness. Clara never liked being the center of anything. But now she understood that being seen wasn't about fame, it was about being valued. And here, in this home that once felt distant and cold, she was finally being treated as more than just someone in the background. The difference wasn't in what she wore. It was in the way people looked at her now, with real appreciation. As the sun began to set and the last guests were preparing to leave, Richard walked toward Clara. He had spent most of the afternoon smiling, talking with relatives and helping Noah enjoy the day. But now his face was more serious. He had been waiting for the right moment. When he reached her, he didn't start with a speech. He just stood there for a second, looking at the woman who had saved his son's life. Then his eyes filled with tears. He put a hand on her shoulder and spoke in a quiet voice. "You saved my son," he said, pausing to breathe, "and I want you to know this is your home now too." Clara didn't respond right away. She looked at him, her eyes watering, but then turned to Noah, who was playing nearby, laughing loudly. That sound, that joy, was all she needed to hear. She smiled gently and nodded, her heart full. Clara didn't answer with a long speech. She didn't try to find the perfect words. Instead, she did what she always did. She listened, observed, and let her actions speak. Her eyes followed Noah as he chased a balloon across the grass. He looked free, safe, and full of life. Clara knew then that all the fear, the memories of her sister, the hard days and the quiet suffering had led her to this moment. She didn't need to be rich or powerful to make a difference. She had shown that real care, honest, deep care, was stronger than any title or job. The house, once a place of work and routine, now felt like a real home, not just for the child, not just for the father, but for her too. She hadn't planned on becoming family, but that's what had happened. And for the first time, she allowed herself to accept it completely. Noah came running back to her, holding a small toy in his hand. He told her he wanted her to be the first to see it. Clara took the toy and smiled. "It's perfect," she said. He smiled back, then sat beside her and leaned against her arm, already starting to get sleepy from the excitement of the day. Clara gently brushed his hair away from his forehead and kissed the top of his head. She looked up at the sky for a moment, then back at Richard, who was watching the scene with emotion in his eyes. They didn't need to say anything more. The message was clear. What saved that boy wasn't medicine, it wasn't security systems, and it wasn't money. It was someone who truly cared. Someone nobody had noticed before. Someone who had been in the shadows until the moment came when her heart and courage changed everything. And Clara finally felt whole. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.